we're going to continue with our series as we get into drug use and addictions this evening. So certainly, as I said, I've been saying all along, we can't cover everything. You know, a lot of areas that you could fall underneath drug use and addictions: prescription drugs, psychoactive drugs, tobacco, alcoholism, porn, sex addiction, self-mutilation, cutting, gambling, overeating, anorexia, bulimia, even workaholics. Sometimes people, they think of all the negative things that are out there, but they don't realize that even workaholics or shopaholics, and there's other types of things that can happen that we can become addicted to. And so again, as I said, we can't cover everything, so we're kind of taking a general approach to addiction and how we can deal with those things. But we can see a lot of these different types of behavior, right? Internet games, debit, shopping, work, love, sex, gambling, food and eating, codependency. And so we can see a lot of these addictions that can get into our lives. According to figures, it says, and this is including people ages 12 and older, in 2012, 23 million people in the United States needed treatment for alcohol and drug abuse. Of those 23 million people, however, only 4 million actually got treatment, making recovery even more challenging. Most people who succeed in treatment commit to a lifelong process of recovery, getting more treatment when needed, living a healthy lifestyle, and relying on family, friends, and others in recovery for support. This is something we got to be really, really careful with, is that when we're dealing with addiction, and I could give you a lot of different stories on this, that people who they have, let's say they've overcome, the reality is you can never get to the place where you say, I'm fine. You have to continue to use different skills and coping things, and you've got that list that I've given you. You have to keep doing those things because you're still can get into those kinds of addictive behaviors. You're never free, if I want to use that terminology carefully. You always have to have, again, a healthy lifestyle. You still have to rely on family, friends, God. Those things have to be a part of your life. It's a lifelong process. And so we have to recognize this. Why do some people become addicted while others do not? A person's risk for drug addiction is affected by several factors. One is genetics. Some genes make people more prone to becoming addicted. Family and social environment. Negative influences can include peer pressure, physical or sexual abuse, stress, poor relationships with parents or friends, and the availability of drugs. Mental health, mental illness could place some people at greater risk for addiction. And age. The younger a person is when drug use begins, the greater chance of addiction. You've got kids. I mean, when I worked in the mental health, it would really blow your mind. For the majority of the time that I worked in there, I was dealing with sex addiction, and I was dealing with sex-type problems, and I was dealing with sexual issues with kids that were 8 years old. And you think to yourself, wait a second here. They're not even reached puberty yet, and yet I have kids at 8 years old who are sexually active. It's mind-blowing, mind-boggling. And so we have to recognize the risks that are going on here. And again, genetics, it's still something that they're studying today, but they have shown studies that if you've got a parent who was a drug addict or an alcoholic, that it increases the likelihood that you are going to follow suit. That's what it was with me and my father. My father was an alcoholic when I was a young boy. His father was an alcoholic. You know, and I remember I told you I'm using that term loosely because they really didn't see themselves as alcoholics. They were drinkers. That's just what they did. My dad was in a softball league. He used to hang out at the bar. They used to drink, go out and play softball. And I grew up in that. You know, I was taking sips of his beer when I was just a young boy. And so it was just a part of life. We didn't consider it that way. So these things can be passed on. Somehow it kind of gets into our wires and of being around it. And again, sometimes we turn to those things because of, as we said here, our poor relationships or stress, because we think that those drugs or that alcohol or those types of things are going to give us what? Satisfaction. But what does it do? After it wears off, we're left with Yeah, we're left with emptiness still. We keep trying to fill it, but it never gets filled. And so we're going to be looking at some of those things. It's interesting. This is a cocaine addict's brain. So here, if you look on the far left, you have someone who has no drug use. And we've kind of used this when we looked at depression and other things. You can see the activity in their brain with all the yellows. But then here's a cocaine addict only 10 days without cocaine. Look at their brain activity. Now look down here. This is someone who was a cocaine addict and has now been 100 days without cocaine. Notice that even though they've been 100 days without it, are they back to the original that they started with? And the unfortunate reality is you're going to find that with many of these abuses, you're never going to get back. You have literally changed the form of your brain. And we're going to look at some of that. But as you can see here, you can see the colored regions that are dealing with these nerve cells. Here's another one. This is using meth. As you can see here in a healthy brain, and then after 1 month of abstinence, and after 14 months of abstinence. If you'll notice, all these holes that are inside the brain versus here, it literally, and I'm going to show you some pictures here in a little bit, that you're going to see the brain, and you're going to literally see holes in the brain because of drug use. And this isn't just meth and cocaine. They have found that sex addiction can actually have similar effects on your brain as a cocaine user and other types of things. So it's really important to recognize these things. And then again, you can see here, meth abuse greatly reduces the binding of dopamine to these transporters in the striatum, a brain that's used for memory and for movement. And so it can affect those kinds of things. And as you can see, as I said here, the structure, literal structure of the brain has changed, and it will never come back. There are some things you can do to heal many of those things, but it's never going to go back. I've got this short video that I want you to watch.
The brain is central to our existence. It generates everything we feel and do. It processes information coming from the outside world, such as the smell of food, and from inside the body, such as sensations of hunger. Using all this information, the brain then makes an appropriate response, driving behaviors that help us survive. For example, getting something to eat. Deep within the brain is a set of structures called the limbic system. The limbic system lies below the cortex, or outer layer of the brain. In evolutionary terms, the limbic system is quite old compared with the cortex. One limbic system structure, the hippocampus, helps us form memories and learn. The amygdala contributes to emotions. The striatum is crucial to forming habits, routines of behavior that we tend to do without thinking, and processing reward. The limbic system contains the brain's reward circuit or pathway. The reward circuit links together a number of brain structures that control and regulate our ability to feel pleasure. Feeling pleasure motivates us to repeat behaviors, such as eating, and other actions that are critical to our existence. A reward, or something linked with a reward, activates cells in the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, in the midbrain. This sets off a chain reaction of activation in the reward circuit. The long projections of VTA cells go to an area called the ventral striatum, or VS. The activation of cells quickly reaches a key part of the VS called the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is often called the brain's pleasure center. When activated, each cell generates an electrical signal. That electrical signal causes the cell to release molecules of neurotransmitter, which act as chemical messengers. Those chemical messages are received by another cell. This is how cells communicate with each other in an activated neural circuit. The brain has many different neurotransmitters, which serve multiple functions. The small gap between the sending and receiving cells is called the synapse. The cell sending the message is presynaptic. the receiving cell postsynaptic. In the presynaptic cell, the electrical signal causes changes. Some packets or vesicles that store neurotransmitter migrate to the cell membrane, merge with it, open up, and release neurotransmitter molecules into the synapse. In the reward pathway, dopamine neurons release the neurotransmitter dopamine. The released dopamine molecules drift across the synapse. They link up with proteins called dopamine receptors on the surface of the receiving cell. These receptors span the receiving cell's membrane, with part on the outside and part on the inside of the cell. When dopamine binds in the receptor's exterior part, like a key into a lock, it triggers a cascade of events inside the receiving cell. Other proteins attached to the interior part of the receptor carry the signal onward within the cell. When there is excess dopamine, and as these molecules drop off receptors, they are free in the synapse again. Some dopamine molecules re-enter the sending cell via a special protein called a dopamine transporter on the sending cell's membrane. Back inside the cell, these dopamine molecules are now available for re-release. In a healthy brain, there is always a moderate level of dopamine in the synaptic space, even in the absence of rewarding stimuli. When a reward is encountered, such as food, the presynaptic cell releases a larger amount of dopamine in a sudden burst. Dopamine transporters will then quickly remove the excess, returning the amount of dopamine to the original level. Dopamine surges in response to natural rewards help the brain learn, adapt, and navigate a complex world. Normal cycling of dopamine release occurs in the VS, activating the entire striatum and limbic areas. Activation of the reward pathway has a far-reaching impact throughout the brain. From the VS, the reward pathway extends to the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. The PFC powers our ability to think, plan, solve problems, and make decisions. The reward system influences the limbic system and the areas of the cortex that process sensory and motor information. Reward system activation also influences the cerebellum in the back of the brain, which affects coordination of movement as well as attention. Normal activation of the reward system creates a physical imprint on the brain that links certain stimuli with rewards that satisfy biological needs, such as food, and make us want to fulfill those needs by seeking out those rewards. Once the brain associates a stimulus with a reward, just seeing the stimulus can trigger a surge of dopamine in the reward system. When someone first uses cocaine, the drug quickly enters the brain, where it blocks the transporters on the presynaptic cell. Since dopamine cannot re-enter the presynaptic cell, it begins to accumulate in the synapse, where it can reach abnormally high levels and remain there much longer than usual. The postsynaptic cell becomes hyperactivated, which produces a feeling of euphoria. This creates an incredibly powerful association between cocaine and pleasure, making a person want to repeat the experience of taking the drug. When someone first uses methamphetamine, the drug quickly enters the brain. At low doses, meth blocks the re-entry of dopamine into the presynaptic cell, just like cocaine does. But unlike cocaine, higher doses of meth can increase the release of dopamine from the cell, leading to much, much more dopamine in the synapse, where it becomes trapped because meth prevents the transporters from removing it. Because so much dopamine remains in the synapse for such long periods of time, the postsynaptic cell is activated to dangerously high levels, causing the user to experience powerful feelings of euphoria, making meth incredibly addictive. Using cocaine or meth has far-reaching consequences on the brain. Drugs alter how the reward center communicates with the rest of the brain, affecting emotions, movement, reasoning, and decision-making. The repeated, frequent use of these drugs can change the actual wiring throughout the brain. These changes will eventually prevent a chronic user from feeling the same euphoria they experienced when first using the drug. Instead, they need to take the drug just to feel normal, and they feel compelled to take it, no matter the consequences.
It's incredible. I mean, this is way beyond even my knowledge, and that's why I wanted to share this video with you, is that and they have found that it's not just meth and cocaine. It's even sexual addiction. All of these addictions that we do are actually interfering with many of the things that we do on a daily basis. And as I said before, that makes me more susceptible. So even if I use those things that I've given you with the coping mechanisms, I'm still susceptible. All I've got to do, did you hear what she said? All I've got to do is see. All I've got to do is visualize something. All I've got to do, if I'm a cigarette smoker, all I've got to do is see somebody lighting up. All I've got to do is smell, right? Those who have used marijuana. I'm not a marijuana user, but I can tell you I've been around it enough that I can tell the difference. I don't know if any of you have walked around, if you've got a sensitive nose, but I've walked by cars, I've walked by houses, and I pick up marijuana smell very, very easily. I can differentiate. And people will get sense of smell that will trigger certain things. Same thing with foods or anything. And so we have to be very cognizant of these kinds of things in our lives so that and I shared with you already with the kid who had quit smoking. And then all he did was go out for a break, and he was around people that were smoking cigarettes, and within a week he was back to smoking cigarettes. It's the same thing with alcoholism, right? I'm an alcoholic. And then I have been alcohol-free, let's say, for 40 years. Does that mean that I'm now prepared to go in and do bar ministry? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to put myself around these kind of things. I've even heard of people that are going through alcoholism, and they say that they keep beer in the refrigerator just so that they can deal with their own willpower. That's not what we do, okay? That's not how we try to handle these kinds of things. So if there are things that we're dealing with, and I told you before, we know the solution, then we have to make sure we don't put ourselves in a position. Same thing with pornography. I told you that before. You know, if you've got an issue with pornography, it's really simple. The two first things you've got to do is get rid of the internet and get rid of your computer, right? And so people will say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. And I'll tell them, well, go to the library for internet. If you need to use email or something, use those kinds of things. Again, we know the solutions to many of these things. And here in this Inspire, this is a great site that I found. And here, this was in November 24th of 2015. And it says that what are three distinct aspects of addiction? Well, one, she talked about it just a minute ago in the video. She says there's cravings for addictive substances or activities like heroin, prescription pain medication. You've heard of people that have gotten addicted to pain meds. They went in for back surgery, and afterwards they couldn't get off of the pain medication. Or alcohol. Brain imaging also has shown that other pleasurable activities, like I said, such as gambling, shopping, sex, can affect the brains of some individuals in the same way as drugs and alcohol. Loss of control over the use of substance or participation in the damaging behavior. It doesn't mean that you can have a desire not to, but there's this again, we just showed you inside the brain, and you have to, again, she made a boo-boo because we recognize that it wasn't evolution. Anybody hear her say that? This isn't evolution. God created us this way. But again, we're interfering with the way in which God created us. Number 3 says, continuing use of the addictive substance or participation in the behavior even after the negative consequences have become apparent, right? You're an alcohol, right? I don't know how many times that I have, in my past, when I was drinking, would drive home and realize I don't even know how I got back there. I remember one time I was at a party, and I was at this party, and it was a fraternity party, and I decided that I wanted my baseball cap. That's all I wanted. So I walked from the fraternity house to my apartment, which was across the creek. So that I went to get my baseball cap, and I came back to the party, and I was covered in wet burdocks all over me. Why? Because I wanted my baseball cap. I mean, my thinking was flawed, wasn't it? Because of even though I recognized afterwards the consequences of my actions, I continued to do them because I enjoyed what I was doing. And so sometimes, even though we recognize the negative consequences of our behavior, we still continue to do them. We talked about this dopamine, a naturally occurring chemical in the brain. It floods the pleasure center, like we said, when substances like alcohol, cocaine, nicotine are ingested. This brings on feelings of euphoria, as we said, and well-being. The likelihood that a person will become addicted to a substance or behavior is directly related to how fast and reliable these things create the release of dopamine in the brain. A stronger, faster dopamine release will generally lead to abuse and dependency problems. And I was telling you earlier, look at the structural difference. You see this? This is a healthy brain on the left, and you can see the addicted brain on the right, where it's literally changing the structure of the brain. And as I shared with you before, there are things that I can do and implement in my life that can improve, and your brain has a great ability to heal. You know, you've had people who have been in car accidents and had major brain damage, and their brains will literally rewire themselves to try to avoid certain areas of the brain that have been damaged. Well, it's the same thing here. Even though this is what's been done to your brain structurally, your brain can still have a level of healing, but it will never get back to its original condition of the healthy brain. And so we have to recognize, as here you can see, again, functional changes of the healthy brain. You can see all the activity here in the yellow, and then an addicted brain, it literally shuts down. So think about this. If I'm dealing with an addiction, the one area of my brain that I'm using to deal with that addiction is my prefrontal lobe, because my prefrontal lobe is where my decision-making is coming from. Well, now all of a sudden I'm faced with a decision that I know that I should make, but what does the addiction do? It shuts it down so that I'm not using my brain and making the right choices. And so it's important. So as I said before, this again, it's across the boards. Exercise is good for addiction recovery. Most of the population sees regular exercise as a means to lose weight. But in fact, science has shown that maintaining even a moderate exercise regimen can reduce stress, fight the effects of depression, create mental well-being. And for anyone recovering from alcohol or drug addiction, regular exercise should become what? Essential part of your new lifestyle. And as I note here, addictions can sometimes be used to fill up areas in life that are empty. And you can sometimes replace addiction with something else. And you can actually become an exercise addict. And I've seen these kinds of individuals where they find something else that's actually helping them, but then they become addicted to that. And exercise ends up being the place where they get their high. But we need to be careful that we don't allow that just to become another addiction. Physical activity releases endorphins, as we said, which are created in the central nervous system and the pituitary gland. They then interact with the opioid receptors in the brain. These are some of our pleasures and pain centers. And a steady flow of endorphins triggers a positive feeling in the body and can act like a what? Analgesic, yeah. Which means they lessen the perception of pain. Here are some of the other endorphin-driven benefits of exercise. I don't know how many of you can do this. Maybe you're limited in what you can do. But as I shared with you before, it's not necessarily having to get a gym membership. It may be just a matter of going for a walk. 75 minutes a week can add 2 years to your life. This is not 75 minutes a day. This is 75 minutes a week. I think we can all do that. 40 minutes, 3 times a week, protects for brain's memory. 30 minutes a day can reduce depression by 36%. It's important. 60 minutes a day can cut obesity risk in half. And so again, we may be in varying degrees on this, but I think we can all do this on some level. The Bible says a lot about this too, doesn't it? For instance, the Bible says in Proverbs 20 that wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. And again, you just think that I'm immune to these things. But the reality is that it just continues to cause more and more problems. One of the stories that I was thinking about when I was putting this together was Belshazzar. And we probably all remember the story of Belshazzar. Belshazzar had a love of pleasure, and he gloried in his power as he shared his kingly authority. And in his pride and arrogancy, with a reckless feeling of security, Belshazzar made a great feast. This is in Daniel 5. To 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. All the attractions that wealth and power could command added to the splendor of the scene. You can imagine all the beautiful women that were there, their enchantments, the guests, the banquet, princes, statesmen, they're all drinking wine like it was water. With reason dethroned through shameless intoxication, lower impulses, passions now in the descendancy, the king himself took the lead in this orgy. As the feast progressed, he commanded to bring golden vessels and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which is in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines might drink therein. It's in Daniel 5 too. The king would prove that nothing was too sacred for his hands to handle. They brought the golden vessels, and the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron, of wood and of stone. And as a result, Belshazzar was told by God that thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. So you can imagine what this scene looked like as they were all partying and having this great banquet. Do you think that Belshazzar had a problem with addiction? I think we can probably say safely that it was at least something, maybe not necessarily to what degree, but there was definitely a clear sign of recklessness, intoxication, unrestrained sexual activity, and maybe more. But if Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, then he would certainly remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, right? Daniel 4 talks about Nebuchadnezzar. What did Nebuchadnezzar do? God put him down on all fours and sent him out into a field to graze. Belshazzar certainly would have been familiar with that story, being his grandson, and yet it didn't seem to bother him in the least. He continued to do, this is, like I said, this is signs of addiction. And like most any addiction, Belshazzar's recklessness made him feel euphoric. In one instance, he would feel confident and in control, but simultaneously releasing brain chemicals related to fear and stress. Bad feelings that linger after the euphoria fade. Then the only way to treat the bad feelings is to start the vicious cycle all over again. Those that have been involved in that before recognize that. You'll get done and you'll finally be sober, and then you'll what? You'll feel good, and then you'll fall back into that behavior, and then you'll feel depressed because you've given in and you've done this, and then you keep going through this cycle of depression and happiness, and depression and happiness. And so what do you end up doing? You either stick to the happiness, or you wallow in the bottle, and you're constantly depressed, and you feel like there's no way out. And so there's this, this constant struggle, and it's true not just for alcohol. It's cocaine, meth, cigarettes, all of these things. We go through this cycle of feeling good and feeling bad, feeling euphoria and feeling depression. And so what could Belshazzar do about it, right? What would he do about it? It says here in, again, Elements of Behavioral Health, this was in 2010, it says it's a long road back from addiction. The drug of choice can be alcohol, street or prescription drugs, or addictive gambling, spending, sex, eating. Although the faces of addiction are many, one outcome remains the same. All persons in recovery need what? Support of others. Peer recovery support services are services that are designed and delivered by people who themselves have experienced both substance abuse disorder and recovery. They know what it's like to be an addict, to struggle with the daily pressures and stress, to overcome the guilt, the sadness, the confusion, and try to find a job, rebuild careers, relationships, and self-esteem. What you find, it's the same that we looked at when we were talking about stress and depression and grief. Oftentimes, the reason why we turn to these things is because there was already present something of sadness, of guilt, of pressures, or other types of things. There was something that was in our life that was already existent, and we turn to these things thinking that these things are giving us release. And in reality, while we're doing it, there is a feel of release. There is a feel of hope. But then as soon as those things wear off, we're right back dealing with our own selves again. And then what do? We go back and we do it again. And we never really ever deal with ourselves. And that's important for us. We have to acknowledge there's a problem, yes, but oftentimes, and that was the problem I always had. Kids would come into our program. As I said, I dealt with sexual problems. And oftentimes, people on the outside would look at these kids and say, oh, they're horrible, they're bad, there's this wrong with them and that wrong with them, and they're looking at it from the external, but they never took the time to find out what was going on. And then when you get inside the house, you would find all the turmoil that was going on. And you'd find out the reason why they were doing these things was, one, to get attention, or two, they found it was a way to get away from whatever it is that they were dealing with. And before they know it, now they're in this addictive process, this vicious cycle that they can't break free from. And so it's important for us to deal with ourselves. And so, again, so who did Belshazzar have to draw from? When you look at his situation, this is the hard part. If you've got young people that are in a home, where are they going to draw from? If we just identified a support system being put in place to help us, what if you've got someone that doesn't have the support system? Where are they going to draw from? Many of the kids that I worked with would draw from the streets. Many of them would find males, because they didn't have a male in their life, they would find males on the street. And the male would be the person that they would look up to. I've got a kid right now that's serving 65 years to life. And I recognized that there was a problem. And I knew that he was going to get himself in trouble because he didn't have a father figure. And he was looking to other men on the street. And he looked to this one guy, and they went in and robbed this house. And he was caught carrying the television out the front door when the police pulled up. Little did he know, but his mentor, if you want to use that term, was inside the house and had had stabbed both the husband and the wife. And the wife died in the hospital, and the husband was severely wounded. But now this kid, even though he wasn't the one that held the knife, he was present, and he got 65. So he's 19 years old. Now he just got 65 years to life. I mean, it's a sad, sad situation. And so, yeah, there are some things. But as I said before, and it's true here too, we can't use the excuse and say that, well, this is what I was dealt. We can rise above those things and use God to help us, or God to use, I shouldn't say use God. Right? We're not pulling God down to us. We're wanting God to what? Pull us up to Him. But here, after 7 years in the field, Nebuchadnezzar raised his eyes toward heaven, and his sanity was restored. Then he praised the Most High. He honored and glorified Him who lives forever. And afterward, Nebuchadnezzar praised, exalted, and glorified the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. So Belshazzar had this to pull from. He had what seemed to be a positive role model. And yet, he went away. And that happens sometimes. There are parents that can do everything, if you want to use that terminology, do everything right with their kids. They can have them in church. They can have all these different things, and that kid can still go off and go away that was never something that you had thought would happen. These things can happen. But what can we do? Be there for them. We just said it, support system. Be there for them. Pray for them, right? And many other things that we can do for them. And so this is important. So again, this is another website, the NIH, it's the National Institute of Drug Abuse, where it goes in and it talks about some different types of things that you can do: cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, motivational enhancement therapy, family therapy, and these things. That, to me, these sometimes are looked at as the first thing. I don't see it that way. I think there are a great many things that you and I can do as far as coping skills that I shared and relying upon God. And it's very unfortunate. Again, I'm not trying to tell you to walk away from here thinking that drugs are bad. And I'm talking about medication drugs. But a great many doctors, even when I was in mental health, the first thing the kid would come through the door and they would immediately say, let's put him on this and this and this and this and this and this. And maybe you have gone to a doctor before and you're dealing with some ailment, and the first thing the doctor wants to do is prescribe you some medication. And I think that shouldn't be our first thing that we're trying to do. I think there are some natural things that we can do in our lives that can help us through this. But again, treatment must address the whole person, not just putting a Band-Aid over it. And so we get into this cycle. I don't know if you've heard this. I've made reference to it a few times, but the stages of change are something that are very real. you have what's called pre-contemplation, which, again, there is no intention on changing behavior. This is very important. If you've got somebody who is an alcoholic or using drugs, and you see this, and you come to them and say, you've got a problem, right? That does not mean that because you identify that problem in them, that they are going to make the change. Because they are in what's called that pre-contemplative stage. They haven't recognized the need for change, and this is important. The only reason why change happens is because you recognize that you need to change. That's when you move to this what's called contemplative stage. You're aware of the problem exists, but you still have made no commitment to action. Okay? And so we move from pre-contemplative to contemplative. Now you move to preparation, which is the intent of taking action to address the problem. But the problem is that even though I am preparing, I still need to find out what things do I need to do. What things do I need to use? How do I want to approach that? That's where we get into action, active modification of behavior. And so this whole entire process, and then maintenance, even though, and that's what I was talking about before, even though I have action, I still have to have maintenance, okay? Sustained change. So when I'm in this maintenance phase, it doesn't mean that I'm free. It means that I still have to continue throughout the remainder of my life, put things in place that allows me to maintain. So do you think that if let's say, for instance, I recognize my need that I have to have a stronger relationship with God, and I pray to God and I say, Lord, I'm going through so much turmoil right now, and I'm doing these different things, and I need your continual presence with me to help me through this. Does God answer those prayers? Yes. Now all of a sudden I'm starting to see success in my life, and things are starting to improve. Now all of a sudden I say, well, then I don't no longer need God anymore. And so my prayer life begins to diminish. Is that the right approach? No, it's not. That relationship with God needs to continue, doesn't it? It needs to continue to grow. I can't just turn away and say, now that it's been fixed, I'm okay. This maintenance involves, if I recognize that I need to be around people that can help me, that can be supportive of me, that understand me, that I can talk to, do you think those kinds of people need to continue in my life throughout the rest and remainder of my life? Absolutely. Okay? Those in here that have anybody in here is willing to raise their hand that's been in alcoholism? Okay? Do you still attend meetings? Yes, you do. Yeah. How many years have you been free from alcohol? 30. 30. Okay, 30 years and you're still attending. You see that? This is important. He cannot just all of a sudden one day say, I'm free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. He has to continue to maintain, right? He continues to go there. And does that also give you an opportunity to share?
Oh, absolutely. And it also keeps you fresh in your mind what it was like
Yep.
at the beginning.
And then there are other guys that are coming in that are new that gives you an opportunity to be a mentor, to be a support system for them to say, hey, I know it's rough for you right now, but look where you can head. It's been 30 years, but this is a process, and you can be there for it. And that goes across the boards no matter what it is. It's not just alcoholism, it's everything. We need to be there for each other. And then sometimes, do we have relapse? Yes. Do we fall back into old patterns? Yes. What happens as a result? We start feeling depressed. We start feeling guilty, right? And actually, I don't have it in here, but I saw some research that was done. They kind of look at it like this. In your brain, you have these synapses that we were talking about before. And they use that as kind of like describing a forest. A person who uses alcohol or cocaine or meth, it's like there's that forest, and they just took a bulldozer through that forest and just made a nice big pathway through all those trees. Now, over time, if they maintain, that forest can grow back. But if they have relapse and they remow that pathway, those trees and those grass areas will never grow back to the fullness of what they had. And the more times that I relapse, the stronger and the harder it is to actually overcome many of those things. It literally reinforces those each and every time. So for instance, someone who has quit smoking and has been free for some time, and they get back into smoking, the addiction is actually stronger for them the second time around than it was the first, as I was talking about with these synapses in your brain as you continue to mow them. Based on self-efficacy data, researchers have estimated that maintenance lasts from 6 months to how many years? 5 years. So some people who say after a year or two that everything is good, they have shown that it's, and again, this is not limited to, but 5 years. While this estimate may seem somewhat pessimistic, longitudinal data in 1990, Surgeon General's report supported this temporal estimate. After 12 months of continuous abstinence, 43% of individuals returned to regular smoking. It was not until 5 years of continuous abstinence did the risk of relapse drop down to 7%. Again, does it say 0%? No, it says 7%. And so, as I said, shame is a very common during relapse. Relationships and connections help to reinforce resilience. There is no magic bullet. So remember, nothing changes if nothing changes. It's real simple. And so there's a lot of things that can create shame. And again, I'm not going to go into all of these, but again, I've dealt with all of these in varying degrees. And some of them, if I had a discussion with you, it would, you'd probably feel extremely uncomfortable with some of these. But I've dealt with all of these before. And again, it makes you feel shame. And many times you're unwilling to share. Because say, for instance, that you're struggling with some addiction. What happens? I'll give you an example. Let's just use pornography. Okay? If you've got someone who is, did you know, I don't remember the percentage, but it's a really large percentage. There's a high number of percentage of pastors that deal with pornography. Did you know? Anybody know that? It's a large percentage of pastors that are dealing with pornography. And you sit there and you go, whoa, you can't be. Well, here's the problem. How many pastors do you think are willing to come out and admit that to their conference? Why do you think they don't want to admit it? Because of what the consequences of admitting it to the conference will be. So what does the pastor do? He keeps it quiet. But yet he continues to struggle with the pornography. And the pornography then doesn't just affect him. What does it also affect? His spouse. It affects his ministry. I mean, it affects everything than just himself. And so many times, the shame, no matter what it is, of any of these things, we're unwilling to share because we're afraid of the consequence. But we have to get to a place where we have to find someone to share. Because that's the only way that we can get through these things. Keeping it silent and internalizing it is just going to burn us up. There's no way that we continue to do these things. It's going to continue to affect these things in our lives. I think I shared this with you before, that I've heard someone say to me, this is a pastor, I've heard them say to me this very thing, that, well, I'm dealing with pornography, but you know what? My ministry is saving a lot of people. If I'll be lost, at least I'll save many. That is not a healthy way to look at things. That individual needs to talk. And I had an opportunity to talk with that individual in more depth. But again, we have to be willing to share. And we have to find somebody that we can talk to that can be there with us. Internet pornography. It's becoming more and more accessible. I mean, the ads, they've got even ads now. Even on Facebook, if you look over on the right margin, sometimes they have crazy stuff that pops up as ads, even in Facebook. And it's a very dangerous society we live in today. It's becoming more accessible. It's more available. And as you can see here, these are some numbers. The top 10 countries dealing with pornography, and 60% falls right here into the United States. You got Netherlands, which is 26%, and you can see it going down from there. But again, it's a huge problem. And it disconnects you from the actual relationship. You get the high, but you get no connection. A lot of people think that the problem is the pornography. And they'll get in, let's say, for instance, it was in the marriage relationship. And the wife thinks that it's the sexual relationship that's the problem. That's not really the problem at all. There's something else that's very deep in this situation. And as I just said here, it's no connection. You think that, and then what you're seeing on the internet isn't real. It's fake. In reality, it disconnects you from your actual relationship. And so this is a real issue in our world today. This was an actual interesting study, too, that was done in 2008, where it was looking at sexual image and drug craving signals, like in brain imaging studies. There's a team of researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, led by Dr. Anna Rose Childress and Dr. Charles O'Brien, showed cocaine patient photos of drug-related cues like crack pipes and chunks of cocaine. Because of Childress and her colleagues also found that regions of the brain activated by drug images overlap substantially with those activated by sexual image. It supports the scientific consensus that addictive drugs usurp brain regions that recognize natural rewards needed for survival, like food and sex. We have a brain hardwired to appreciate rewards, and cocaine and other drugs of abuse latch onto this system. What makes this even more difficult is media. I've got rid of TV because, again, the commercials. I remember a number of years ago, my wife remembers it too, it was her grandfather. We went to visit them down in Texas. And I was there in their living room, and they had he had a religious station that was on, and I said, hey, do you mind if I change the channel? So I changed the channel. I don't know if it was a sports game or something, I don't remember what it was. And I changed the channel, and one of the commercials that came up was a Victoria's Secrets commercial. And you should have seen the expression on his face when that Victoria's Secrets commercial came up. It was total and utter astonishment. His eyes, his whole body, you could see, was reacting to that Victoria's Secrets commercial. Now fast forward, this was probably 15 years ago. Now fast forward to today. What are the commercials like today? What are the TV shows like today? I mean, and we're promoting these things as being healthy, as being normal, and it's not. And I may make you, there's no kids in here, so I'll share this with you too, is that when I worked in the mental health, we had boys that were dealing with sexual issues. And one of the therapists, he actually felt that the best way for that child to release tension and stress was masturbation. And he promoted masturbation with the boys. I had a real issue with that because, again, what did this do? This increased problems on the unit with female staff. Because what are the boys doing now? They're visualizing female staff and mixing that in with masturbation. And it was a mess. And again, the way people are thinking today is just out there. And we have to be really, really careful with images. Because what we see in movies, what we see on television, what we see on the internet, all you got to do is go to the grocery store. What some of the people are choosing to wear today is just mind-boggling. And we have to be really careful. What's that thing we always sing to our kids? Be careful, little eyes, what you see, right? Be careful, little ears, what you hear. I mean, we have to be really seeing these things. So, again, it usually isn't about the sex. It's about affecting one's mood that you find when you do the research. And so the addiction, with addiction, there may be short-term gain, but again, there's long-term pain. Remember that. With addiction, there may be short-term gain, but there is long-term pain. So the opposite is true with the cycle of change. Because success will be measured on short-term pain and long-term gain, we can walk into programs and be unhooked physically quite soon. But emotional and spiritual depends can take what? Can take time. And we need to trust the process. Some addicts have very little or no hope, and so you're not alone. And so again, we have to recognize this. Remember that. Short-term gain, but long-term pain. And so as I said before, shame is very common during relapse. But we have to have relationships and connections. I like this verse in Hebrews chapter 2. It says, "For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." There is nobody else in this world that recognizes what you and I are going through. And it's someone that you and I can talk to, isn't it? And if at this very moment, if you are dealing with some sort of hardship in your life, addiction, I can tell you, I guarantee that there is one person already available that you can talk to, that will listen, that won't pass judgment, that loves you no matter what, unconditionally, and that's Jesus Christ. And we can talk to him and relate to him our feelings. He says that you can call on me in the day of trouble, and I'm going to do what? And I will deliver you, yeah. And so sometimes we know what needs to happen, right? Get rid of the internet, password protect, accountability partner when using the computer, practice healthier living habits, deal with past hurts and trauma, have humility that you must stay connected, and that you are never free from temptation, choose your friends carefully, take part in community, anti-drug, tobacco, alcohol programs. We know these things, but we have to continue to practice these things. And there's a lot of different options. Again, there's more than this, but I've just given some 12-step programs, detox programs, peer recovery, support services, other types of therapy, Christian and faith-based addiction programs. I mean, no single treatment is right for everyone. I want you to listen to this. Oh my goodness, this is a powerful, powerful testimony. And I want you to listen to this right now.
You know, I think about my young life growing up. The one thing that always sticks out to me is how desperately I wanted to have the love of my father. Growing up, I was always angry, and anger for me always turned into violence, and violence it always ended up with me getting into trouble. I started getting involved in real low-level sale of marijuana. Low-level sale of marijuana turned into pounds of marijuana, and pounds of marijuana turned into cocaine. Started dating a former girlfriend, and the next thing I know, we're pregnant with a son, and I'm just a teenager with really no prospect of anything positive in life. Colleges wasn't an option, and all of a sudden, my dreams went from playing sports to being a kingpin, a drug entrepreneur. Something that I thought was for losers, I now somehow morally justified because I didn't use drugs. I can remember going into Harlem, New York, and being the only person on the block that looked like me, and going into elevators with men with Uzi machine guns and shotguns. And I can remember the adrenaline rush that I got. There wasn't a fear, it was a sort of a rite of passage that I was experiencing by going into these tough and possibly harmful environments. And I can remember going to the back room and seeing a man sit at the table where I would drop a bag full of money, and I would walk away with a bag full of cocaine. I would start taking that cocaine and I would begin chopping it up, with saran wrap it around my legs all the way up to my torso, put on a double-breasted suit with a silk tie, put on a pair of Italian loafers, grab a briefcase, and I'd walk straight through the airport metal detection, daring somebody to stop me, because I was angry. What's amazing about the world of illegal narcotics and drug entrepreneurship is that I didn't trust anybody. I can remember chasing my best friend down the street with a baseball bat and trying to break his ribs when I finally caught him, because I found out that he had went into my son's mother's pocketbook and had stolen from her. It's all an illusion. And so I never had anyone that I felt was truly a friend when I was in that world. I flew from New York to Atlanta. I got in my car and I was driving back up the coast, and a state trooper pulled me over. And when he came to the driver's side door of the car, and he had a 9mm pointed straight at my head, and he said, "Boy, put your hands out the window of this car and climb out onto the ground, or I'm gonna blow your head off." I put my hands out the window and I climbed out the car, and I laid on the ground of the interstate. The police officer would come and he'd tie my hands behind my back as well as my feet together. He would find blocks of cocaine in the trunk of my car, and this time I knew I had been caught red-handed. And I knew I was going to jail. I remember watching as my son was born, just thinking to myself, I'm always going to be here for you, son. I want you to know that I'll always be here. and I'll never leave you. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, I called home to the one person who always took my phone call and always got me out of trouble. Mothers worry about their children. My mother, who saved me from everything, couldn't save me this time. But she cried out to somebody who could. She looked up into heaven and she said, God, if you exist, will you please help my boy? The next morning I woke up, an inmate came and he punched me right in the square of my back, kind of sending a message to everybody in there: I run this block. Nobody's coming in here to take over my thing. And when he did, I grabbed a food tray and I tried to break his head off into the wall of the prison. That was natural for me. I was angry, and anger always turns into violence for me, and violence always ends up with me getting in trouble. Then something very unusual happened. They sent the man who hit me back to his cell in isolation. And normally that's where I'm supposed to go too, but they look at me and call me by my last name. They say, "Yo, Veneta, you want to go to church?" Church was a 6x9 prison cell. There was one other inmate who was sitting in there with me. He handed me a little small brown book. It's called a Gideon Bible. And he looked at me on the floor of that prison and he said 8 words that changed my life forever. He said, "You look burdened. Can I pray for you?" I don't remember the words of that prayer, but I do remember it ended in Jesus' name. And as I would walk out of that 6x9 prison cell, the other inmate who was with me, Andrew, had asked me about my son. And I told him I have a 1.5-year-old son. And I made him a promise that I would never leave him, that he would never have to grow up not knowing who his father was. And here I was doing to him the very same thing that I promised him I would never do. Well, I didn't realize how much trouble that I was in until I go from the prison to the courthouse to find out how much time I'm looking at. And I remember sitting there, and there was a bunch of guys that were attached to me with chains. When their name was announced, they would say, "Well, you're looking at 6 months probation, you're looking at 3 years, you're looking at 1.5 years. And then they announced my name. And they told me that I was looking at 25 to 40 years in prison. And I remember hearing the guys say, "Man, what did you do?" And all I could think of was my little boy growing up not knowing who his father was. Reality for me had set in, so I started to pray. And I remember the only prayer that I had made to God wasn't that I wanted him to get me out of what I had gotten myself into. My only prayer was, before I go away, let me go and say goodbye to my son. I didn't ask him for justice, but I cried out for mercy. I would then call my attorney. He says, "You're never going to guess the news that I have for you." I said, "What?" "The DA said that they're going to null pros my charges, which means you've been arrested, but you're never going to go to trial. You're never going to face conviction, and 12 to 24 years that I was guilty of was wiped away." I couldn't believe it. I ended up doing a total of 2.5 years in prison. That's for every set of charges that I had. And all I can remember is him looking at me and the smile that he got on his face when he would see his daddy, and lifting him up and holding him and feeling his little feet dangling from me, and him trying to tell me everything that he had done since I'd seen him last. And I remember just the great joy that I got in hearing my son talk to me, and knowing that my son loves me, and knowing that my son misses me. And for me, it just translated into how God must feel when I reach out to him. On my way here today, my son writes to me in a text, "Pop, I'm proud of you. And I'm glad that you allow me to be a part of your story." And I say, "Son, I wouldn't have a story if it wasn't for you." The benefit for me of being a father is it gives me the desire to be a better man. And it gives me the desire to know that I have to live a life that is an example for my own son. My name is Dutch Bradley, and I am second.
Powerful testimony, isn't it? That it doesn't matter, what it is that you're struggling with. That we recognize what the title of this was is I am second. That we put it in God's hands. That he can help us through whatever circumstance that we're dealing with. And I love this passage in Matthew 6:34. It says, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." And so God wants us to put our trust in him, doesn't he? So that no matter what it is that we're dealing with, then he'll see us through. And he'll get us through whatever circumstances it is, right? And we just have to put our trust in him. Pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this testimony that was given, and each of us here this evening, each have a testimony as well of varying things that have gone through hardships, tribulations, and have come through alcoholism or drugs or any addiction. Many of us maybe are going through these now, Lord, and we're fighting through these. And Lord, I ask that each person here would just surrender themselves to you. They would find someone that they can talk to, someone that they can share with. That they would use some of these skills, coping skills that we've identified. But first and foremost, Lord, that they would just surrender to you. That seems to be one of the most difficult things for us, because we feel like we have to have control somehow. But help us to let go here this evening, Lord, to surrender to your will, to follow whatever path and direction you send us. Thank you for bringing those that have come out here tonight, and we look forward to continuing to talk of ways of balancing our lives. Again, we thank you and we love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We've got our drawing now. For those, we did not do the drawing for church service. So we have two names we're going to draw, one from this morning's service